this panel explores the very timely topic, which again was referenced in most of the other panels we've heard in the past 3 days, which is the need to figure out how to agree to disagree in a democracy. So obviously, we've seen an erosion in people's overall civility and tolerance when it comes to engaging and listening to others who hold different opinions and beliefs. And as a result, it's becoming harder for people to even listen to the other side of an issue respectfully without getting attacked. And we heard that in the online harms panel. So today we've got these amazing panelists who will unpack what's underneath our growing polarization and how we can speak and listen across difference. And moreover, what else is there that we can do? What practices can we engage in to allow us to work together? So it's now my pleasure to welcome Mala Khanna, Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet for the Privy Council Office, who will introduce our panel members. She is the Deputy Secretary to Cabinet responsible for the governance portfolio, which includes democratic institutions, machinery of government, and legislation and house planning. And before joining the Privy Council office, Mala served as the Associate Deputy Minister of the Department of Canadian Heritage. Prior to that, she held the positions of Assistant Deputy Minister of the Sub-Saharan Africa branch at Global Affairs Canada and Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet Parliamentary Affairs at the Privy Council office. Over to you, Mala.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to start off before I introduce the panelists to you, just express my appreciation to the hosts, TMU and OCAD, and all of the partners and sponsors, student volunteers for really providing us with this platform for collaboration and for connection, for critical thinking on a topic that I know we all feel very close to and care about and are concerned about. And so really, really excited about the opportunity to be able to have a conversation. I'm going to tell you right now, this is a chatty bunch. So they might disagree, they might not, they might just all get along famously. I think they will get along famously even as they disagree, and they will model what that looks like. Because this is a fundamental, the ability to be able to have good, fierce public debate is a fundamental democratic right. It's the pillar of our Westminster system here in Canada, but it is difficult and it's elusive, and we're seeing the impact of polarization, real or created, really deteriorating public debate. And so I think you're also seeing, as was mentioned with the op-eds, and there was an open letter just last week that really cross-partisan, prominent sectors across the country, really wanting to say we need to be able to live alongside divergent views and be able to have conversations where we fundamentally don't agree but respect each other. The Governor General, too, had a symposium a couple of days ago on how to have respectful digital dialogue. So this is, and absolutely has been a recurrent theme over the last couple of days. So we really want to get into why is it hard to do, and why can't we attack the idea rather than the person? And why is there a need to demonize those who have a different view? So we have three incredible leaders who are going to come at this from different perspectives. And as I say, we're going to have a conversation between us and then with all of you on this. So let me get to who we have. François Cusset is a writer and intellectual historian, a translator and columnist, and currently professor of American Studies at the University of Paris in Nanterre. He has done work. I'm not going to go through the whole bio for each because I want to be able to get to the conversation, but I'm just going to give you a little bit. François really has done work on ideological conflicts and culture wars tearing at the world's social fabric. And he has a most recent book that tackles today's global quarrel over wokeness. And he has traveled from Paris to be with us today. Next, we have Sarita Srivastava, who is a professor of sociology and the dean of faculty in arts and science here at OCAD U. Her research areas include social movements, race, and emotion, and she is the author of a book from the New York University Press called Are You Calling Me a Racist? And Why We Need to Stop Talking About Race and Start Making Real Anti-Racist Change. And we have Laurie Mulvey, who is a clinical professor at Penn State. She's the director and co-founder of World in Conversation, Center for Public Diplomacy at Penn State. Her focus is on cross-cultural dialogue and collaborative critical thinking. The center has worked with universities in more than 30 different countries to host cross-border dialogues and have radically open dialogues. So really looking forward to hearing from Laurie on that. So let's get to it. The first question I think we'd like to hear from all three of you on is just what does this concept of agreeing to disagree mean to you? How do you come at it? And do you agree with it as a concept?
Can I start? It's a desperate plea for help from the humans. And I don't agree that it's a goal. I think what I've seen in many, many decades of being a part of small group conversations is that it's where we go when we don't know where else to go. And we think the best we can do is just find a way to respect each other, and that's it. Not to be influenced by each other or to be transformed by what we might hear that we don't already think. So that's where I start.
Say a bit more
About how did I get there?
Yeah, the work that you're doing and how you came to that place.
So the work that I'm doing started out as a co-curricular exploration of conversations after class, class being a race class that my husband actually has been teaching for many decades. And I was a volunteer to bring students into dialogue or to train some facilitators to have those discussions after class. That just grew into my entire life. To where we started a project on campus, which became the center, the World in Conversation. And so starting with the conversation about race, where we were asking, what's going on with race on this campus? Because we had an uprising on campus in regards to a race issue that was multicultural. So it was a really interesting thing. It started with the death threats toward the president of Black Caucus, but then a multicultural group of people took over the student center. So after, long story short, after that uprising, we started this campus conversation saying, what's happening with race in our generation? And that just became a large center that it is today and became international, where we've been doing online dialogues for about 12 years with people all over the world. And so what I learned from the core conversation, which was the race conversation in the US, which is not just a US conversation, was about the role of inequity and asymmetry in conversation. What are the limits of conversation and what is the power of conversation? To the point that really our work now is to use conversation not as a goal, but as a tool for building solutions across divides. Because I always say that we don't solve problems with our friends, we only solve them with our opponents. And our opponents have really important information about the world that we don't have. And to the extent that we exile our opponents, we exile a really important part of the world of information we need, whether we like it or not, or whether we like how it's said or not. That's the work of the dialogue and the facilitators of dialogue to help us work through. And we have methods for that. We just have to use those methods. And I think what I see is we can. We just have to do it.
I'm going to ask you one more question just because
love
it's a chaser and I just can't resist. What are the methods? Like, how do you be able to set the stage for a conversation on race where you want to hear what people really think, and yet you want to do it in a safe way and yet a transformative way? Like, How do you set up a conversation like that?
Well, actually, we've learned a lot about that. And I know you and I spoke the other day about the critique of a therapeutic kind of dialogue. And there's lots of reasons to critique dialogue itself, which I've been working with for all of these years and building the work with people, students in particular, from all over the world and all kinds of perspectives. So I feel like I just represent a team of people. But what we did about 8 years ago, after spending many years doing dialogues, not just about race eventually, but about all kinds of issues from drinking on campus to sexual assault to war, uh, I said, what I realized over the generations of people at universities was that we got to a point where we could no longer actually talk about race, in my view, in a real way, because of some of the rhetorics and narratives that we had inherited over the years. So what we started to do was we called it blow up the dialogue and start over. So we said, what would we want it to be if we could make all of these things possible, that there weren't people that were unduly carrying the burden of the dialogue to explain things and teach people or to just receive information. So anyway, long story short, we've really been building a sociological method, not a therapeutic method, but a way of centering differences, inequalities, and social position, not empathy. Actually, that always happens when people come together, but that is not a goal. And in fact, the intention is to teach people how to better stand in their position, not political position, but sociological position, and say what they see so that we can think together with all the data, because what's always in conflict is the facts. So really, what are the facts? We never know until we're actually looking at all the facts, and we don't do that very well because we learn facts, we have experiences, and then we say, well, these are the facts, and until you agree on them with me, we won't talk. And what I see is the facts are the very thing in dispute. And so we have to build the truth together. And so that's what we've been doing, is building a method that is sociological and not therapeutic. And we can go from there.
Okay, let's keep going. As a professor of sociology, I mean, you can respond to that, but you can also, talk about what this means to you from your vantage point.
We were talking earlier, Laurie and I, we were thinking, are we going to find a way to disagree? Because we actually fundamentally, I think, even though your work is about conversation and dialogue, we both agree that the uh, basic premise can't be just people hearing about each other, looking introspectively about their own feelings, sharing their experiences, that it has to be a focus on what is it that we want to transform. So my work also comes out of my experience of working and teaching about race. So I spent many years as an activist and saw across all the organizations that I've worked in that the go-to method for talking across difference and working through moments of polarization is let's talk to each other, let's talk about our feelings, let's learn more because we don't know enough. That there's a fundamental belief that racism comes out of a place of ignorance or evil, that there's a moral and emotional landscape that makes the only route possible to look at the self. And so that anti-racism becomes then a key to the self. And there's very few ways to get out of that conversation. And so I think the way that my work relates to this conversation about polarization is to think that there are a few ways that we can think about polarization as both strategic and in the first place, and secondly as an effect that lingers in the work that we do in our communities. So one is that we have to acknowledge that there is a strategic advantage to polarization. And so that's not the place in which I'm working. I'm working in places in which that way of speaking that comes out of cultivating polarization, which is an emotional stance, a discursive strategy, a valorization of extreme position, and so on, becomes a standard, comfortable way of speaking within our own communities, in which we actually are not that polarized in terms of our shared values. But yet it becomes it becomes linked to this valorization of emotion, emotional expression, as a natural political problem-solving way that supposedly is a counter to bureaucratic rationality. So it's like this is the real effective way to connect with each other and to solve problems, which is to speak about my experience, my feelings, as authentically as I can, whether that's really angry at you, whether that's you know emotional, upset, etc. And this is what we see as a standard strategy, particularly in anti-racist workshops, which is what I write about, diversity work, which is that we can't instead sidestep and say, what is the structural, systemic, practical work that we have to do, whether that's analyzing the division of labor on our campus or in our organization, who does what, whether it's hiring practices that we want to change, whether it's the services that we provide. Rather, it's we first have to look inwards, learn more, acknowledge our ignorance, etc., whatever the topic is. So I think that's the way, the place in which actually Laurie and I, even though we come at it slightly differently, I might critique dialogue and she cultivates it. We both agree that what it is that we talk about matters. So when a workshop becomes not a place to reflect on ourselves, learn more, acknowledge our ignorance, or even to let's say declare our ignorance, right? In some cases, it's I want to deny that I'm racist or homophobic. In other cases, it's I want to declare that I am because it demonstrates how woke I am, or it demonstrates how knowledgeable, etc. I am. It demonstrates my credibility. In either case, it's a key to the self. So if we can shift away from that conversation to ask, what is it that we want to do? What do we share in common? What community do we want to build, for example? Not what do we agree on in terms of our political beliefs, but what is it that we're trying to get done? It's an old model of coalition building, which is that we don't have to necessarily actually agree politically, but that we share a particular, goal, political goal, a shared vision, a shared community that we want to build, and that's what often gets lost within. And I'm not talking about the larger political landscape here. I'm talking about within our organizations, and within our spaces in which we already are often have a shared value and shared belief about what we want to build.
So it's more about common action and finding common ground for actions that can be taken than it is about personal reflection and sharing of personal experiences. Is that an
Or even about personal beliefs, right? I don't agree with you on this thing, but we both agree that we're here in this organization to educate students, for example, or to build a particular kind of joyful community, for example. And yet, because it's a standard discursive strategy to speak in this very polarized, emotional way, and because it's cultivated, let's say within social media, for example, there's an advantage to speaking in that way structurally, that becomes a particular kind of practice, and that there are other practices that we can engage in to get that same work done.
And I just want to add that I don't think this can be done without facilitators. And that's actually another thing that, sorry, François, because I want to get into your your piece. But it's so important to recognize that groups where all of these things happen, where social life happens, groups they're a phenomenon. And we as humans, I think, are constantly taking on the idea or trying to say to each other, we need to be better individuals, either because we need to reflect and introspect, because we need to be better communicators. And I don't think that that's helpful. I think what's most helpful is to recognize that when we work on these issues, we're in groups that have a life of their own, and we need experts who know how to help manage those groups, not how to tell people what to think or to police the group so people say the right things or make sure they don't say the wrong things, but actually to make those groups more functional. Because when groups are functional, humans are amazing. And when they're not functional, we do the worst things ever. And so for me, there's a lot of speaking of sociology, right? There's a huge small group component to this that needs to be managed, and we can't do it when we're in it. So we have to have people who can do it, do it with us. Referees, you might say, but that's a really bad analogy because we do a lot more than referee when we're facilitating, but we have to hold the tension of our differences. For me, less find common ground and more find, we can build solutions that have bits of all of our views in them, but I would say we don't look for common ground. We work with our differences, the really important differences that we have. You have to jump in
Okay,
now.
François, let's hear from you.
Okay. Very interesting so far. But maybe I'll take a step back in maybe the historical and political background of the question. Disagreement is the essence of democracy. Okay. In fact, the definition of democracy is manageable disagreement. Right? We can discuss, we can disagree, we can negotiate. It's not the end of the world. I would even say democracy is about relative disagreement. You could say dictatorship is about absolute disagreement. Disagreement leading you to prison, to death, to disappearing. Right? This difference between democracy and dictatorship no longer exists, or at least is highly blurred today. Right? Democracy, as we understand it, liberal democracy in our countries, is in deep crisis. Okay, in fact, worldwide, because the ethics of discussion, of discussing, of managing disagreement together, no longer works. Okay, disagreement is dramatized, staged, used by various political forces to become an absolute force of division. Right, instead of being managed in existing institutions, which, by the way, makes people no longer believe in democratic institutions if they don't play this role anymore. But this is not so new. Okay, it's a matter of decades almost. And what's very interesting is that the most contemporary quarrels, disagreements, the most visible ones on social media over racial difference, gender difference, discriminations, minorities, are not so new. They have been in place for a long time. Activism, a commitment to defend minorities have been around for a long time. And the strategy of their enemies, okay, of powers in place, of ultra-conservative forces, of majorities, to divide them, to point at them, to mock them, have been in place for decades, okay? Remember, 1990s, we had a national debate in the US and way beyond over what was called back then political correctness. Okay, it's the exact same debate as wokeness today. Then next decade, remember 9/11. After 9/11, after those terror attacks, it was the clash of civilizations that was imposed as the new worldview. Okay, we have various cultures and civilizations, and we disagree in absolute terms with each other. But that was imposed. Okay. Then came the wokeness thing. Okay, with the issue of religion. What I'm saying here is that a good part of this disagreement is artificial, is imposed by forces who have a direct interest in dividing public opinion. Who have this interest? Social media. I mean, the web giants who organize and stage this. I read that in the program there was a remote intervention by Frances Haugen, the former Facebook engineer, who revealed that algorithms were programmed and written to favor artificial polarization. Okay, so it's mathematics. It's not ethics. Then it's the talk show culture. Okay, maybe it's a weird pun, but in my view, the clash culture is a way to dissimulate the class struggle. Okay, we invent clashes about everything. Some clashes do exist. I mean, when Black Lives Matter activists face, white supremacists, on the East Coast of the United States, this is a real disagreement that, turns, into a real war, right? But another dimension, a good dimension of it, is artificial, is fueled by social media, talk shows, and political forces. What is their interest? Their interest is to divert attention away from the real divisions, the real enemies, the real disagreement. Who do we really profoundly disagree with? Climate change deniers, okay? Racist or sexist people and forces, all right? Or defenders of political or religious absolutism. Okay, and these people are in power more or less everywhere. So in order to divert attention from their powers, we create fake divisions. You know, Sigmund Freud used to call it, I mean, I know this expression is not so welcome these days. He used to call it narcissism of small differences. You know, when feminists, I don't know, like what we call in France, white feminists opposed to post-colonial feminists, right? When they disagree with each other to the point of hatred, right? When within the LGBTQ plus community, those disagreements take the same, you know, dimension. When moderate and radical environmental activists disagree, this is narcissism of small differences. They are on the same side. We are at war, okay? I mean, you know, globally, historically, and the best interest of powers in place is to divert attention from the real cause, the real enemies, and stage and create and dramatize those smaller conflicts or disagreements.
Can I just build on it real?
Sure,
just
sure.
one small
Being
comment.
too long anyway.
No, we're agreeing too much. But here's the most
Sarita will change that.
volatile. Yes,
You can tell by
she's
the-
waiting. She's waiting. The most volatile conversations I have ever been in 35 years of conversation are about money, class, that any race, war, gender, assault, all of the things. The most volatile ones are when you actually peel back the layers of the class structure and actually start talking about what's really possible. And you know, with young people, with undergraduates, they're all thinking, I'm going to be a billionaire. I'm going to be what, and it's like, guess what? You're not. So now what? Right? And it's so just to say, like, it is
Absolutely.
fascinating and painful.
But I mean, just to add one point, it's the artificial fabrication of moral panics by opinion leaders, you know, ideologues who create panics among, you know, more conservative people about, you know, you name it, abortion, the death penalty, transgender persons, you know, I mean, all these issues of today, they create moral panic around it, when in fact, it was not a fear. It was not a point of panic, and it becomes a point of panic. It actually becomes a reason to vote for them, okay? You know, there's this book by this US journalist, Thomas Frank, an old book from 20 years ago called What's the Matter with Kansas? He was asking a very simple question. He was taking the state of Kansas. He said, in the state of Kansas, people are poor, okay? There's a major recession. There's no more social programs. And yet, they are turning to a Republican vote. They vote for Republicans who are going to slash these budgets and be bad for their, you know, average income. Why do they do that? And the reason why they do that is that Republicans were smart enough to impose issues, moral panics about, you know, abortion, death penalty, crime, you name it, in order to divert attention from what? From the fact that social programs no longer exist, from the fact that Democrats do almost a better job at managing the economy than Republicans. So in other words, they need to distinguish themselves. So they chose these issues, they imposed it on us, and now we're trapped with these.
And just to say before, Sarita, I know you're going to jump in.
Okay.
It doesn't, what you're saying and what I'm shaking my head saying yes to does not mean that harm doesn't exist, right? That there isn't oppression or repression or trauma or all of the things that we're all worried about. But it's that we can play on those things and distort them and make them such that we miss who is or what is the enemy, so to speak, or where can we put our efforts and how and who can we partner with or collaborate with, I should say. So it's not to say, oh, those things don't exist, which is not what you're saying, I know. But just to recognize, when we feel in our bellies that these things are real, they are real. It's just how, I'll just go from that. They are real.
Well, that's what I was actually going to ask Sarita to maybe reflect on do you think that's right, that characterization that it is a distraction from the real issues when what we're seeing is hateful and vitriolic and can seem when it's gender-based, race-based, core identity issues that feel like they're being slashed. Is that right to say that that's insignificant? I don't know if that's what you were saying. Trying to be
Not
provocative.
exactly. Do you mind if I take a second to maybe
Sure.
clarify what I meant?
Okay.
I'll put it in another way, which will be much clearer. The fact that half of US voters might be voting for Donald Trump in November, okay, almost half of it. The fact that in France, 30 to 40% of voters vote for the Le Pen candidate, a fascist or far-right party, does not mean that these millions of people are racist, sexist pigs at all. It means that because liberal forces, when in power, have given up on working classes, okay, have literally let them go, okay, have favored, upper middle class, profits, corporations, and everything. They feel abandoned, and feeling abandoned, they fall in the trap of these populist discourses telling them, come with us, right? So they end up voting for racist candidates, parties, and discourses which they do not share. It's so important to remember this, that people voting for Trump are not all racist, okay? You can put it another way, that the 80% of people voting for Putin in Russia, right, are not pro-Putin, okay? Basically what I mean here is that let's beware statistics. So there are profound divisions. There is a war of values and ideologies, indeed, but not 50-50, not like an unsurmountable difference. It's also sort of masterminded, okay, by people who have an interest in staging this ideological conflict. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, thank you. That is helpful. I do want to give the floor to Sarita.
I just wanted to say that I think we have to be careful not to mix that analysis that you have, which with referring to what's happening, important debates within social movements, to refer to them as a narcissism of small differences, I think is unfair. So we can get into a longer discussion about the feminist movement and the ways in which it was transformed and what prevented it from hearing critiques from feminists of color, for example. But I don't think that that's I wouldn't want to put that in the same basket with your political analysis of Trump and politics in Europe today. I don't think that's a fair comparison, because those debates within social movements are very much about what is the core of what egalitarianism is, what is a woman, what is it, what are we actually fighting for, and to say that opposition to the core ideas of those movements was simply minor, and because it didn't involve class, perhaps, which it did, of course, because women of color were saying the issues of immigrant women, for example, the issues of economic issues that were not about reproductive choice, for example, are also feminist issues. So I think too often that critique, that important critique that you're making, gets applied then to quite significant debates within social movements, without which we couldn't have these other conversations.
No, I absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. I'm not denying the importance and the reality of these differences. These disagreements among various minority groups. It's also, we have to think about them against the background of a major global change too, which is the what a great Indian philosopher called the provincialization of Europe, or even the Western world. Okay, we no longer live in a world run, ruled, or guided by Western power, Western principles. So there's a major displacement. Okay, the rise of the global South, the rise of what we used to call minorities, which happen to be statistical majorities, right? And whose struggles are, actually conquering rights and advancing. So this is for me the background. And within this background, you're absolutely right. The debate between what we call in France white feminists and feminists of color is extremely important. I'm not denying it at all. What I'm saying is that when circumstances demand a sort of united social movement, maybe not united like erase your differences, but strategically united. Okay, remember who are your enemies and the fact that they're threatening you to death right now, in the present moment. Then strategically, these differences have to be put aside in the very moment of struggle. Okay, when whatever, if next November in the US there is some sort of a quasi-civil war in the street, then disagreements have to stop. In France, when you have a major social movement stopping the country for a whole season, these disagreements have to stop because there's a larger, more systemic one, in place.
Yeah, I just want to say I want to make sure that we're not making a false dichotomy between what is systemic on the one hand and then what is difference, actually profound differences in analysis. So you can do both. You can hold on to, we have actually genuinely profound, significant, meaningful differences in politically, at the same time that there are also really important systemic changes that we agree on, we want to make together. And those two things, one does not have to be subsumed in the other. That doesn't make this thing over here more minor or less important. It means that we may also work in coalition while we disagree. So I think that's the very concept of coalition building, in fact. So it's not that these systemic things are more important and we must put these minor things aside, but that despite the profound differences in vision and life experience, that we can nevertheless work on the same structural or political goals together. But I think that's the
No,
thing I wanna hold
I
on to.
absolutely agree. I mean, there shouldn't be any hierarchy between the various issues we're discussing here. Gender discrimination, racial discrimination, social or socioeconomic disparity. If we make a hierarchy, then we play the game of the enemies. There shouldn't be any hierarchy, but there should be a connection made between all of these things, which, by the way, bears the name, the familiar name of intersectionality, right? It's the first way of thinking that these various struggles need to be connected, interwoven together. So that's exactly what I'm saying. And yes, indeed, let's not put one factor, one paradigm above the others, because then we recreate the hierarchies we're fighting. Right?
And I would just add that I think a lot of this is, what do I want to say? It remains theoretical in a way, putting the pieces together, because we don't have the proper methods, or we don't use the proper methods, meaning I can't count how many times I'm in a conversation that doesn't have a facilitator, or that we don't need a facilitator. When I talk about the fact that I train facilitators, or our center does, and that I think is one of the most important professions that we could change. When people either they go to sleep when I'm talking, or just think, oh, that's sweet, and move on. But the work just to use this example, if we are just maintaining a divide, right, where we could talk about white feminists and feminists of color, I'm not saying there's no meaning in that, of course there is, but that is the beginning of the way things get stitched together, and not stitched together where we pick one over the other, but where I always say it's 1 + 1 = 3. There's a third. And if we can't get to the third, it's not because we don't want to, it's because we haven't put ourselves in. Hang on, let me back up for a second. What I'm talking about is not new. I did not figure it out. I always talk about the parable of the blind scholars and the elephant, which is from 500 BC. With the insight of that parable is that the humans are all smart people, but they're blind to the thing in front of them, and they each have a reality that they're seeing. One feels this thing called a tail, another the trunk, another the foot, whatever it is, and they all think they have the truth. But what the truth is that they need each other to figure out what the truth is, right? And we're so convinced so often that we have the truth, or a bigger part of it, or a more moral part of it. And anyway, so what I'm saying is I feel like these kinds of outstanding divide isn't the right word, but where we still have to talk about, or divide, it's because we haven't been able to get to the thing that is the third. And that's the only thing, I don't know what else to call it. It's not common ground. It's not agree to disagree. It's not, it's something that didn't exist before we all came together. Meaning with the voices, in this case, of women of color, white women, but even just to use that formulation, though extremely meaningful to articulate what is missing from, quote, white feminism, my point is that there is something else. There's an alchemy that if we don't hold the tension toward the solution, if you will, we will never get to what you were suggesting about, well, when we really see the enemy, then then we come together. We have to come together, not with compromise, but with building what is feminism, for example. I'm not saying that's not what the intention is or that it isn't happening, but I think we fail to see that we have methods that can help us, and people, professionals.
What I hear in your conversation, the question that I have is not for you to answer necessarily, but just to leave it here, is where is social power? How is social power situated within what François is talking about and what you're talking about? I heard it from Sarita a little bit, but that's just one of the things that I have as a question mark for me. I saw someone in the audience. Okay.
Oh, I think I'm told to go. I'm like disembodied. I'm over here.
Okay. Who is talking right now? Okay.
I've been enjoying the conversation, but I keep being struck by the way society seems to operate these days is that I have the right ideas. I know the truth, and I'm surrounded by people who agree with me. And the rest of the world's divided into those who are unenlightened, are stupid, or are wrong. The fact is that, and I'm sorry to say, there's a bit of that that's coming out of the panel today, that there's sort of the truth. I guess what I'm wondering is, what do we do with those people who hold views which you find, I'm now not talking about so extreme, extreme racism or violence or that sort of thing, but views on issues that, hills you're prepared to die on, but they're on the other side. What do you say about someone who is very strongly anti-abortion? Where do they fit in the dialogue? How do we have a world where we don't say they're either unenlightened or stupid, and come together when the fact is these are such divisive subjects?
Can I answer that? Well, based on what I see?
Okay, let's make sure we
Real
yes,
fast.
and then I want to give others a chance to.
The real quick answer that I see is that most people are not that. Most people are not the people willing to die on a hill. Most people are to use the bell curve. Most people have complicated ideas. They're willing to listen to other things. And I'm not saying this in some romantic way. I'm just saying that every time I get into a group of people about a really controversial issue, which is all the time, I am always amazed that those people are not there. And I don't think it's because of who I'm selecting. I've spent a lot of years selecting the most extreme people to be in dialogues with. And most people are just not that. And so I think we need to focus on the most of us who aren't that and build our world with most of us.
Sarita, or François, do you want to add?
Well, it's an interesting question. I would ask it in a very different way. I think the way you asked the question, if I could paraphrase, is something like, what do we do with these people who disagree with us? And I think I would begin with most of us begin with a very different question, which is, how do we accomplish this change we want to see in the world? So if you look at the women that worked, the people in the community in Canada that worked for years to get the abortion law struck down, for example, they didn't go, what do we do with these people, which are some nameless people we've never met and are imagining what they're like. They went out and worked as activists, going out to churches, to community groups, to connecting with people the way that a movement and change is built. That's the way we make change. We don't start by saying, what do we do with those people? We say, what are the practices and strategic things that we do to gradually build a movement. And that's what they did, is they went out and spoke to people and spoke to communities and gradually over many, many years shifted the way that people thought about this question. It's not a what do we do with, it's a how do we build a movement, or how do we build a conversation, or how do we practice this differently. I think that's it's because I think that what do we do with those people gets us back to there's, in a sense, the core of your question, which is that we imagine those folks to be, irredeemable, or very different than us, or people we couldn't talk to, and we imagine it on an individual level rather than thinking about it as a long-term practice of change, of social change. And I don't have a good precise answer, because every question that we work on is going to have its own answer. Every movement that we build is going to have its own unique strategic practices. connected to it. And it's often very local. Like that example I gave is something on a national level, but often the things we're working on are within our own organizations. And it's easier to see the answer to that because the people are within our organization or in our space.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the question you asked is the only important question, I would say, because if we are to disagree among people who agree with each other, it will be a fake disagreement. So yes, the real disagreement has to be, staged and confronted. Now, what I would add to what you said is the decline, maybe the loss of shared principles, shared values, shared institutions. Back in the days, I mean, I'm not saying it was better. It's very dangerous to say that the past was better, right? But the educational system, political institutions, existing parties or unions, you know, provided some sort of collective structure in which progressists and conservatives, pro-life, and pro-choice, all these opposed people were part of those same structures, so had something to share. They no longer have. So yes, indeed, organizing this disagreement, this discussion is made very difficult nowadays. But here again, I would add what I said. If this disagreement is radicalized, meaning if, for example, pro-lifers make a connection with, I don't know, creationism, okay, putting in question, obvious scientific principles, then we might have to say there is no way we can even stage a discussion with these people, okay? But if pro-lifers don't go there, but for religious reasons, okay, view abortion, okay, as a sin, a crime, or whatever, then yes, a discussion is possible. Do you see what I mean? But those who radicalize this disagreement, again, are those who organize the discussion, are those who have a direct political or economic interest in radicalizing it. So I'm not saying this discussion you're pointing at is impossible, but let's make a difference between where it's possible and where it's not. That's what I would say.
Okay, great question. I'm going to go to one on Slido, and I'm getting we need to move on. So one question on Slido, and then hopefully we have some time for another question from the floor. As panelists from Canada, the US, and France, how do our nationalities influence discussions, and how do we ensure fair dialogue with global perspectives? Who wants to take that one?
I guess I would say this is another one of those very practical. It's a very practical question that I know I face all the time in the work that I'm doing because, and this is the intention of our work, to create a method that centers our different positions. And when I say position, I mean almost like geographic, almost as if you were geolocating yourself somewhere on the planet. It would include a matrix of factors that would be, your race, your gender, go on and on. But it would also include, I grew up in the mountains, I grew up in the desert. Literally, where you're positioned on the planet determines what you can see in a real, or what you encounter and what you touch, right? So the question, how do our nationalities influence? I mean, it's one of a profound number of things that influences everything. How do we ensure that dialogues are taking in other perspectives? We make sure that there are everyone in those conversations are. I mean, I'm thinking of small group conversations. They have to be represented, and that means, like I've said, even more than anything, it means perspectives and positions that we don't value. And so that's the work of a facilitator, is to make sure that's happening and happening.
Okay, I'm going to intervene with the work of a facilitator because I am absolutely getting the. So I'm just going to say thank you very much to the three of you for a really invigorating conversation, and thanks to all of you.